that soldier inside that hole was alone in the middle of hell. Wounded, with his heart almost powerless to pump fear throughout the rest of his body, he waited. He knew very well what had led him there. These were those moments of war when the victory counted by many also seems to be yours. The soldier knows about death, he knows the terror of war, but nothing prepares him enough to live the pure horror of the threat of being torn apart by the enemy. That day, the Russian advanced with his companions, following the orders of someone who was not running alongside them. He continued with his boots hitting the hard ground and observing the landscape filled with the sad tones of destruction. Drones were a constant threat on the way. They forced the combatant to divert his attention from the trenches that were his target, to raise his head for fear that a grenade would suddenly fall on his squad. He knew he was being watched. In the brief moments when they were forced to stop and look for cover, someone would see the cursed demon flying over them with the eye of death locked. Sadistically, the drone waited, with the grenade at the ready, just moving from one point to another as it seemed to mock the shots in its direction. But the wave could not stop. The Russian tide was rising. Each soldier walked through the destroyed trees, walking in an apocalyptic scenario that could only be seen in movies. The imagination played with those moments thinking about glory. But fate now mocked the soldier in the midst of terror. The sight of the enemy trench was a relief. It seemed that they could finally stop being just targets for artillery and put their triggers into practice. The wave that arrived there had lost some of its strength hitting the sand, but was still trying hard to drown the Ukrainians. It seemed possible. Russian gunfire began to clog the air. The tension on the men's faces was slowly replaced by the momentum of the new phase of combat. They knew that other trenches had collapsed. The Russians started to smile. But war mocks man's happiness, making him long for glory only to be overcome by shame and fear. One of the men heard us together and ducked down on instinct. The others still had their eyes on the sights and only realized when the air shifted like a convulsion and hit their bodies. The world turned into black smoke filled with shrapnel. The Russian cursed in the smoke, looking up and knowing that there must also be one of his drones there, indicating which path the wave should follow, to then flood the Ukrainian trenches. This has worked many times. The soldiers had seen that day before they left their defenses, when one of their own threw the little winged demon at theirs. Too bad no one noticed that the Ukrainians had also summoned the same demon, but in blue and yellow colors that had flown above that operator. Then he saw in those defenses who was piloting the drone. Then the artillery observed calmly, oriented itself with the evil eye of the lenses, and the shots came, filling the Russian position with smoke. And that was the closest point where the wave could retreat if everything went wrong. And there she would resign and return to the attack. Unfortunately, it was also close enough to the Ukrainians. The same demon, blue and yellow, flew through the Russian Pinchera looking for new somethings. He found unguarded ammunition there, like candy offered to a child. A precise artillery shot lifted a dark mushroom into the sky. Far ahead, near the Ukrainian trench, the soldier was still stunned by the explosion next to him, cursing the absence of his drones, cursing the absence of his artillery. Little did he know what was happening behind. At the moment, he was preoccupied with being grateful for being far enough away to not suffer the consequences of the shockwave from the thrown grenade. Fortunately, he had escaped the first impact, but the Ukrainian artillery continued. The sky turned stormy over the Russian sea, and bodies began to pile up. Tired, the men realized that the danger now came not just from above or below, but from behind in their ranks as they continued to carry out those orders. Armored support did not exist, much less artillery. Where was the artillery in those days, and the tanks that had often successfully helped storm the Ukrainian trenches? The soldier prayed for Russian bombs falling from the sky, but all he saw up there was the damn propeller of the Ukrainian drones. The first to retreat began a silent call to return to cover. They were exhausted men, with death at their heels. Sometimes this was literal. One of the soldiers was following his colleagues when his foot touched the wrong place. The mine exploded, eliciting a scream of pain that made the man in front stop his escape and turn around. The two looked at each other for a second, but the looks ended with the understanding that one was certain of death and the other would move on with the possibility of life and the certainty of shame. Fear overcame the weight of conscience. In the midst of the bombs, the man continued to be overcome by despair at abandoning his companion and aware that to stop was to die along with him. To his utter helplessness, he saw smoke escaping from the rearmost positions where he had hoped to retreat. 24 survivors of the advance needed to run back, now in the open without protection, to a new position. The Russian wave was returning to safety. The tide was going out, but crossing no man's land in an open field was a nightmare. The smell of smoke filled the lungs, suffocating the Russians with fear. The horror increased even more when the United artillery got a new start. The soldier saw the bomb explode next to him. The impact wave slammed into him, fluttering across his skin. Almost deafened, disoriented, his eyes barely saw the hole in front of him. There he protected himself, injured, scared. In no man's land, watching his friends disappear behind the trenches, he remained for 3 days. Horror by day. Terror in the night, knowing that the Reaper was more likely to rescue his soul than his companions to recover him alive. From above, the Ukrainian drone watched. Like an executioner. Behind, the other Russians waited helplessly. He closed his eyes, thinking about the irony that he was fighting alongside thousands for possession of a land that people couldn't agree on who owned it. But now he died alone in a dug grave that everyone agreed to call no man's land.
Release the Kraken!